How has this week gone for you?
It's gone well. You know, I think it's an important process because this is one of the most important decisions that the mayor is going to have to make. And I think the community needs to weigh in, and the person that's going to be selected for this job needs to make sure that's the right person for this community.
There are people who believe the mayor has already made her decision. I'm sure you've seen the headlines. You know, you're following this process closely. You've got Carmen Best, kind of an insider favorite. She's excluded from the top 3. She's put back in the top 3. And now there are headlines saying this is a predetermined outcome, that she's going to get the job. I imagine you wouldn't be sitting here if you thought that.
Correct. I mean, I think that the mayor is going to select the person who she thinks is going to fulfill her vision and be able to take the Seattle Police Department on the continued path to reform and the best fit for this community.
I don't want to belabor it, but you know, Seattle can be very political at times. As you have watched this process unfold, all the drama that was surrounding Carmen Best's exclusion, the anger surrounding her exclusion, the fact that this other guy drops out, she's back in, these headlines come up. Is there any part of you that's like, no thank you, Seattle, no thank you? You
know, Seattle and Austin are very similar when it comes to the politics and things of that nature, the landscape of the city, the challenges that they're facing, and so it doesn't surprise me.
It's a question I asked the other outsider candidate, Inspector Frizzell. I always wonder what makes someone who has dedicated themselves to another city halfway across the country decide that they want to pick up and move to Seattle and start to lead a new department. So for you, why is that worth it to you?
So my family and I visited here several years ago on vacation, and we really fell in love with the city. The walkability of it, the beautiful views. My mother lives down in the Portland area. I have a lot of friends that live here. And being an assistant chief of police in a large organization, you know, the Austin Police Department is 1,900 officers. If I'm going to be a chief of police, it's going to be in another major city. And so I think because of the similarities between Austin and Seattle, I felt that it was the right fit for me. And I think that a lot of the transformations that have taken place in our organization, both culturally and within the community, building trust, I think that I can bring a lot of that with me here and translates well to Seattle.
I'm going to edit out the part where you talked about how nice Seattle is because we try to keep it a secret. We don't want people coming here. It's too full. But in all seriousness, this idea of an outsider, right? You know, this department has gone through reform for 7 years. The idea of the reform process was to put it in a position where it can move forward, where it could run itself. And so now this idea that they've done all of that, they've complied with all of that, but they still need an outsider to come in. It ticks some people off. It ticks off the rank and file officers. So if you're to get the job on your merits, how do you convince them that you are the man to lead them and to lead this department into its next chapter?
You know, it's interesting because even in the talks that I've had with officers, with some of the precinct captains, and with the SPOG, there are a lot of ideas that I've brought forward to them that they're on board with, changes that I would make, changes that I would try to implement immediately. And I think that as an outsider, I see things from a different perspective. And a lot of times when you're inside an organization, it's all you know, and you don't know anything different. And so the culture and the things that are going on just seem business as usual and the norm. So having a fresh perspective to bring with me, new ideas, I think that's helpful.
Coming in here, I'm guessing and I'm hoping you did your homework. What do you see as some of the fundamental public safety issues facing the city of Seattle that you could address?
So I think the public safety issues are concern over crime and victimization of people in the downtown area and dealing with the homelessness crisis. And the perception that the officers aren't able to enforce laws.
Their hands are tied. That's how they feel.
And so I think that making sure that I have the ability to work with the city attorney and the county attorney and district attorney to come up with a comprehensive plan about how we can enforce the laws and hold people accountable for their behavior, but at the same time work with the health and human services aspect of it to get people the help that they need to get them into treatment or into some other type of program, but they have to be things that work.
You touched on something that this city has a heck of a time finding, and that's the balance between how do we be compassionate to individuals who are suffering, and how do we make sure that that compassion doesn't come at the expense of all the other citizens in the city of Seattle and of disorder throughout the city, not just in downtown. So for you, where do you see that balance being, the balance between compassion and law and order?
Yeah, I think that it is a delicate balance, and you have to make sure that you have the resources in place to direct people when it comes to the compassionate piece of it. But also, when they're violating the law, they have to be held accountable, just like anybody else would be held accountable. You can't you can't criminalize somebody for being homeless, but you also can't allow them to be criminals because they're homeless. And so I think it is a balance to make sure that we have the resources in place to get the people the help that they need, but also hold anybody accountable who violates the law.
I'm sure I'm not breaking any news to you, but there are going to be few things you do where you please everyone. Very few things you do where everyone is on board with it. So are you willing to make those tough decisions, especially on this issue when it says, look, our department needs to do this, our officers need to take this enforcement action. You might not like it, you might not think it's compassionate, but we have to do it anyway. Are you willing to take the blowback from that?
Absolutely. And the chief of police position is not an easy position
no,
to be
it's
in.
not.
And you're never going to make everybody happy. But, like you said, the primary focus of the police department is public safety. And not only public safety when it comes to data and crime, but also the perception of public safety. Because if the citizens of this community and the visitors in this community don't feel like they're safe, then they're not. And so we have to make sure that we balance that, but also make tough decisions to enforce crime, but also be compassionate when you do it.
You come during a time when officer morale is pretty low. I am sure you've seen the news reports that officers are leaving the department. We already have low staffing on the department. I'm sure you also know what it takes to be able to get an officer hired through the academy and into a patrol car. It's not easy, it takes time, and it's pretty dang expensive to do. So as we see officers start to leave this department for issues of morale, not the other issues like retirement, what could you do as an outsider coming in if you get this job to convince them to stay? Because if we lose too many, that impacts public safety.
Yeah, so I think the first piece of that is getting a contract. We've been out of a contract in Austin for 8 months, and I've seen the impact of morale and people leaving just in 8 months in Austin. And so I can see how not having a contract for 3 or 4 years can impact morale and retainability for officers here in Seattle. So I think getting a contract is the first piece of the puzzle, and that's going to help with retention, and it's also going to help with recruiting. But I also think it's important as the chief to get out there with the officers on patrol so that they can build confidence and trust in you, and understanding that if they're out there doing the right thing, that I'm going to support them. Are officers going to make mistakes? Yes, they are going to make mistakes, and they need to be held accountable for that. But when they're right, they need to make sure they have the backing of the executive staff and the chief.